conference room felt colder than usual that morning. 10 people sat around the long glass table, laptops open, coffee cups half full. The weekly executive meeting had already started when I slipped into my chair near the end of the table. I was used to sitting there, not at the centre with the directors, not beside the CEO, just close enough to the screen to run the presentation, and invisible enough that no one really noticed me. Except my boss, Greg Whitman, Senior Vice President of Strategic Accounts, and the man who loved reminding everyone exactly where I stood. Greg leaned back in his chair, adjusting his expensive cufflinks while the CEO finished reviewing last quarter's numbers. Then the conversation turned to the largest contract our company had ever pursued. A deal worth almost $40 million. And suddenly, every eye in the room shifted to Greg. The CEO looked at him. "Greg, I heard the negotiations got complicated this week. What happened with the final proposal?" Greg cleared his throat dramatically. "Well," he said, glancing around the room like a performer about to deliver a speech. "There were a lot of moving parts." He paused. Then he gestured casually in my direction. "Luckily, I had my assistant handling the background work." A few people turned their heads toward me. Not with interest. With the polite, distant curiosity people reserve for office furniture. I forced a small smile and looked down at my notes. Greg continued. "I led the negotiations personally, of course," he said confidently. Then he added with a smirk, "But you know how it is. You need someone to push the paperwork." A couple of people chuckled quietly. My chest tightened. Because I knew something Greg didn't. Something that made my stomach twist as I sat there quietly. The truth was, Greg hadn't led the negotiations. Not really. In fact, 3 nights earlier, the entire deal had nearly collapsed, and Greg hadn't even noticed. Because he had left the office early for a charity dinner, while I stayed behind trying to fix the mess. I stared at the table, hoping the conversation would move on. But Greg wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly and said something that made the room go completely still. He pointed his pen toward me and said, "Emily works for me." Then he shrugged casually. "Anything she does on that project ultimately comes through my desk." The room went quiet. I felt every pair of eyes drift toward me. For a moment I considered speaking, telling them the truth. But before I could even open my mouth, the CEO slowly folded his hands on the table and asked a question no one in that room expected. A question that made Greg's confident smile start to fade. He looked around the table and said calmly, "Then can someone explain to me who actually saved the contract on Tuesday night?" The room went silent. Not the normal kind of silence you get during meetings. This one was different. The kind where everyone suddenly becomes very interested in their laptops, because no one wants to be the first person to speak. Greg blinked, just once, but I could see the confusion on his face. "Saved the contract," he repeated with a small laugh. "I'm not sure what you mean." The CEO didn't smile. He turned his laptop slightly so the screen faced the rest of the table. "I received an email from the client's legal team Tuesday night," he said calmly. "They were preparing to terminate negotiations." That got everyone's attention. One of the directors leaned forward. "Terminate?" "Yes," the CEO replied. "Apparently, there was a clause in the revised agreement that exposed them to unlimited liability." Several people began whispering quietly, because a mistake like that on a deal that size, could destroy months of work. Greg cleared his throat again. "Well," he said quickly, "that must have been a misunderstanding. My team handles dozens of contract revisions. Sometimes legal departments panic over minor details." The CEO looked at him for a moment. Then he said something that made my heart start pounding. It wasn't minor. He clicked something on his laptop. The client said they were ready to walk away. A low murmur spread across the room. Greg shifted in his chair. "But obviously they didn't," he said quickly. "We're still negotiating." "Yes," the CEO replied slowly. "They changed their mind at 11:47 p.m. Now everyone in the room was listening carefully, because no one at this company worked on contracts at midnight, except me. The CEO continued. "They told me someone from our company called them directly, walked their legal team through the issue, proposed a revised clause, and had the updated language in their inbox within 30 minutes. Greg frowned. "That sounds like something my department would handle," he said. The CEO tilted his head slightly. "That's what I assumed." He paused. Then he looked directly at Greg. "So I asked the client who helped them." Greg nodded confidently. "Well, of course they would. And they didn't mention you." The sentence landed like a dropped glass. Greg's smile disappeared. For a moment, he just stared at the CEO. Then he forced out a laugh. "Well, maybe they meant someone on my team." The CEO didn't respond. Instead, he slowly looked down the table, past the directors, past the managers, until his eyes landed on me. And suddenly the entire room turned to look in the same direction. My stomach twisted, because I had never spoken during one of these executive meetings before. Not once in 6 years. Greg followed everyone's gaze, and when he realized where the CEO was looking, his expression hardened. "Emily," he said sharply. His voice had none of the friendliness he used 5 minutes earlier, only warning. "Did you contact the client without clearing it with me?" The room felt smaller. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Because technically, Greg was right about one thing. I hadn't cleared it with him. I slowly closed my notebook and lifted my eyes. 10 executives. 1 CEO, and my boss staring at me like I had just crossed a line that could end my career. I took a breath. Then I said quietly, "They were about to cancel the deal." Greg's jaw tightened. "That wasn't your decision to handle." The CEO leaned forward slightly, but Greg kept talking, his voice getting sharper. "You're an assistant, Emily." A few uncomfortable glances passed around the table. Greg didn't seem to notice. "You schedule meetings. You organize documents. You take notes." His eyes locked on mine. "You don't negotiate $40 million contracts." My hands were shaking under the table. But the truth was, if I hadn't stepped in that night, there wouldn't be a contract anymore. And everyone in that room was about to find out why. But before I could say another word, the CEO spoke again. And what he said next made the entire room lean forward. "Emily," he said calmly, "can you walk us through exactly what happened Tuesday night?" Every eye in the room was on me. I swallowed slowly and glanced at the screen in front of the CEO. "Tuesday night," I began carefully. The client's legal team sent an updated draft around 7:30 p.m. Greg shifted beside me. He clearly didn't like where this was going. They added a liability clause, I continued, but the language conflicted with Section 14 of the original agreement. One of the legal directors frowned. Conflicted how? I leaned forward slightly. It removed the liability cap. That got a reaction. 3 executives immediately started whispering to each other, because without that cap, our company could be responsible for unlimited damages, which meant the client's legal team would never sign it. The CEO nodded slowly. That's what they told me. Greg cleared his throat loudly. Yes, well, he said quickly. Those details are normally handled through proper channels. Emily sometimes reviews documents before they reach my desk. I felt a quiet frustration tighten in my chest, because that wasn't what had happened. Not even close. I took a breath. The email was marked urgent, I said, and Greg had already left for the evening. A few people glanced at Greg. His jaw tightened slightly. I had a charity event, he said defensively. I didn't respond. Instead, I continued. The client's legal team had already scheduled a call with their board. They were preparing to recommend cancelling the deal. The room grew quiet again. One of the directors asked, "So what did you do?" I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud felt strange. I called them, I said. Greg turned toward me immediately. You what? They were about to terminate negotiations, I repeated. I asked if they could walk me through their concerns. Greg shook his head in disbelief. You had no authority to do that. The CEO raised a hand slightly. Let her finish. The room settled again. I continued. They explained the issue with the clause. Their lawyers believed it exposed them to unlimited liability under US commercial law. The legal director nodded. That would scare any board. I continued. So, I reviewed the original agreement and proposed alternative language. Greg let out a quiet scoff. You proposed legal language. I met his eyes for the first time since the meeting started. Yes. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. This is unbelievable. But I kept going. I suggested reinstating the liability cap while adding a shared indemnity clause to protect both sides. Now the legal director was staring at me. Wait, he said slowly. You added a shared indemnity. I nodded. That satisfied their legal team. The room fell silent again. Greg looked around the table, clearly uncomfortable now. Well, he said quickly, even if that happened, it still would have needed my approval before they accepted it immediately. The CEO's voice interrupted him. Greg stopped mid-sentence. The CEO looked down at his screen again. The client told me the proposal solved the issue in less than 30 minutes. No one spoke, because everyone in the room understood what that meant. A contract worth $40 million had nearly collapsed, and the person who fixed it was sitting quietly at the far end of the table. Greg shifted again, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Well, he said carefully, I'm glad someone on my team stepped up. He forced a smile. That's exactly why assistants support senior leadership. The words hung in the air. For a moment, no one said anything. Then the CEO slowly closed his laptop and asked a question that made Greg's face go pale. Emily, he said calmly, before you worked as Greg's assistant, what was your job at your last company? Greg didn't like that question. I could see it immediately. His head turned sharply toward the CEO. I'm not sure that's relevant, he said quickly. But the CEO didn't look at him. He was still looking at me, waiting. The room was completely quiet again. I felt 10 pairs of eyes on me. I hesitated for a moment, then answered honestly. I was a contracts attorney. A few people straightened in their chairs. Greg froze. At Harrison and Cole, I added. That name got a reaction. Even the CEO raised his eyebrows slightly. Harrison and Cole was one of the most respected corporate law firms in Chicago. One of the directors leaned forward. You were a lawyer? Yes. Another executive frowned. Then why are you working as an assistant? That question hung in the air. Greg quickly jumped in. Emily joined our team in a support role 2 years ago, he said quickly. She handles scheduling, documentation, and internal coordination. The CEO didn't take his eyes off me. That wasn't the question. My hands were still resting quietly on the table, but my heart was beating faster now, because the truth wasn't simple, and I had never talked about it at work before. 3 years ago, I said slowly, my mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. The room softened a little. I moved back home to take care of her. I paused. Big law firms don't really allow flexible schedules. A few people nodded quietly. So I left. Greg shifted uncomfortably. And eventually I took a job here. Someone asked gently, as an assistant? Yes. It was the only role that allowed me to work predictable hours and still be available for my mum. For a moment, the room felt different. Less corporate. More human. Then the CEO asked something else. Did Greg know you were a contracts attorney? Silence. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was complicated. Greg spoke before I could. Well, he said awkwardly, her resume mentioned legal experience. The CEO tilted his head slightly. Legal experience? I reached into my bag slowly. Greg noticed the movement immediately. Emily, he said under his breath, that's not necessary. But I pulled out a thin folder anyway. Inside was a printed copy of the contract revision from Tuesday night, and another document, my original resume. I slid both across the table toward the CEO. Greg leaned back in his chair, clearly uncomfortable now. The CEO opened the resume. His eyes moved across the page. Then he stopped and looked up at me. You weren't just a contracts attorney, he said. I shook my head slightly. No. The CEO looked back down at the page. Then he read the line out loud. Senior Contract Negotiation Specialist. He paused. 8 years. One of the directors let out a quiet whistle. Greg said nothing, because everyone in that room was slowly realizing something. For 2 years, a senior negotiation specialist had been sitting 10 feet away from them, scheduling meetings, taking notes, and fixing problems no one else noticed. The CEO closed the folder slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked directly at Greg. Interesting. Greg swallowed. But the CEO wasn't finished. He turned back toward me and asked one final question that made the entire room hold its breath. Emily, he said calmly, if the client had called again Tuesday night, who would they have asked to speak with? The question hung in the air. If the client had called again Tuesday night, who would they have asked to speak with? I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew exactly how uncomfortable it would make Greg. I looked down at my hands for a moment, then back at the CEO. They asked for me, I said quietly. The silence in the room felt heavy, not dramatic, just undeniable. The CEO nodded once, as if confirming something he already suspected. Greg shifted in his chair again. "Well," he said quickly, forcing a smile, "that's understandable. Sometimes clients get familiar with support staff during negotiations." The CEO raised a hand. Greg stopped talking immediately. Then the CEO looked around the table. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said calmly. On Tuesday night, the client's legal team was prepared to terminate a $40 million contract. Several heads nodded. They contacted someone in this company. He glanced at me briefly. Who reviewed the agreement, proposed a legal solution, and delivered revised language in under 30 minutes. No one spoke. The CEO leaned forward slightly. And that person, his eyes moved slowly across the room, is currently working here as an assistant. The sentence landed like a quiet verdict. Greg stared at the table. For the first time since the meeting began, he had absolutely nothing to say. One of the directors leaned back in his chair and shook his head softly. "That's incredible." Another executive looked at me with new curiosity. "How long have you been handling things like this?" I hesitated. "Whenever they come up." A few quiet chuckles moved around the room. The CEO closed the folder again and tapped it lightly against the table. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. "Emily." I looked up. "I think we've been using your skills very inefficiently." A few people smiled. Greg didn't. The CEO continued. "Starting next week, I'd like you working directly with our legal and strategic teams on major contract negotiations." I blinked, because I hadn't expected that. Not here, not like this. He added calmly, "Officially." The legal director immediately nodded. "We could absolutely use someone with your background." Another executive said, "Especially if you work that fast under pressure." Greg finally spoke again, his voice much quieter now. "Well, if Emily transitions to another role, we'll obviously need to discuss departmental adjustments." The CEO gave him a polite smile. "I'm sure we will." Then he looked back at me. "Are you interested in stepping into that role?" For a moment, I thought about the last 2 years. The late nights, the invisible work, the quiet corrections, and all the time someone said the same sentence Greg had said earlier. "You work for me." I smiled slightly. "Yes," I said. "I think I'd like that." The CEO nodded. "Good." Then he stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. People began closing laptops and gathering their things. But as everyone stood, something felt different. Several executives stopped beside my chair. Not to ask for coffee, not to hand me notes, but to introduce themselves, to shake my hand. Greg walked past me without saying a word. And for the first time in 2 years, he didn't look like the most powerful person in the room. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a single meeting, with one simple question. Who saved the contract?